How many chances are there to live through the worst fate, not once, but twice? Is it even possible to survive when not one, but two atomic bombs fall on you just days apart? And how would such an experience reshape someone's view of humanity, of technology, and of the very future of our species? In the summer of 1945, a 29-year-old Japanese engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi was forced to face those impossible questions. Against all odds, with a probability estimated at 1 in 100 trillion, he endured not one, but two nuclear explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and lived to tell the tale. His skin burned away in the flames and grew back, twice. His eyes were seared by flashes brighter than the sun itself. His ears were torn apart by thunderous blasts that wiped entire cities off the map. Decades later, his voice, fragile, scarred by suffering, echoed inside the United Nations. He carried a message that no other living soul on earth could deliver. This is the story of a man who looked into the abyss of human self-destruction twice, and still emerged to speak for the hundreds of thousands whose voices were silenced forever. Tsutomu Yamaguchi's hands were meant for creation, not destruction. They were used to drawing instruments, not weapons. Born on March 16, 1916 in Nagasaki, he grew up in a country rapidly transforming from a feudal society into an industrial power. "I wanted to build things that would bring people together," he later explained, describing his decision to become a marine engineer and design ships to connect Japan with the wider world. By the summer of 1945, Yamaguchi had already built a reputation as one of Mitsubishi's most promising young engineers. His specialty was oil tankers, vessels vital to Japan's naval ambitions. Yet, as the Second World War dragged on, the empire was collapsing. American bombers rained fire across Japan's cities night after night. Food was rationed to stave off starvation, while the military leaders still refused to surrender. Despite the chaos, Yamaguchi's personal life offered rare islands of joy. He had married his beloved Hako, whose smile helped him forget the war for a moment. Together, they were raising their infant son, Katsutoshi, who had been born to the wail of air raid sirens, sounds that had become Japan's lullabies. "When I held him in my arms, I promised him a peaceful future," Yamaguchi recalled years later. "And I made that promise even while I was helping design ships for war." That same summer, he was assigned to a 3-month business trip to Hiroshima. The separation from his family was painful, but the engineering challenge captivated him. He was working on a design for a new, more efficient tanker. By mid-1945, American B-29 Superfortress bombers had already reduced 67 Japanese cities to ash. During the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, the flames grew so intense they created their own weather system. A fire tornado with temperatures soaring above 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. In a single night, over 100,000 lives were lost. Living under constant air raid sirens had become routine. So, when a lone B-29 appeared above Hiroshima, few worried. True terror only came when squadrons filled the skies. As his assignment in Hiroshima came to an end, Yamaguchi packed up his instruments and belongings, eager to return home. 3 months away from his family had felt like 3 endless years. The morning of August 6, 1945, began for Tsutomu Yamaguchi with one thought: the hope of finally going home. He rose early and headed to the Mitsubishi shipyard to collect his travel documents. But then, the quiet of dawn was broken by an unfamiliar sound. High in the sky, A lone B-29 bomber flew far above the usual altitude. Yamaguchi instinctively looked up. A single plane didn't seem dangerous, yet that moment would change history forever. The sky that summer Monday was warm and crystal clear, like a watercolor painting. Against that backdrop, it was easy to spot the solitary aircraft. Like many residents of Hiroshima, Yamaguchi paused and followed it with his eyes. It seemed like it was searching for something, he later recalled. I thought it must be a reconnaissance plane taking photographs of the city. At exactly 8:15 a.m., he saw a small object drop from the plane, drifting slowly by parachute. First came curiosity, then unease, and suddenly a blinding flash erupted, brighter than the sun itself. It felt as if someone had pressed a lit match against my cheek, he said. In the very next instant, the world was torn apart by the first atomic bomb ever used in war. It detonated nearly 600 meters above Hiroshima. Little Boy carried 140 pounds of uranium, but only about 1 gram. The weight of a paperclip underwent fission. That tiny reaction released the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. The air at ground zero instantly heated to a temperature hotter than the surface of the sun, creating a fireball expanding faster than the speed of sound. Yamaguchi was about 3 kilometers from the blast, far enough to avoid instant death, but close enough to stand at the razor's edge of survival. The shock wave hit him like a speeding truck. His body was hurled into the air and slammed into a potato field nearly 20 meters away. The left side of his face, arm, and hand were burned raw, his skin bubbling into blisters. The pressure change ruptured his eardrums, and his eyes, scorched by light no human should ever see, went temporarily blind. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear. All I felt was searing pain tearing through my body. I was sure I was dying, he remembered. Consciousness slipped in and out. Minutes or hours lost meaning. When his vision began to return, the world before him had become a nightmare. The city he knew no longer existed. In its place lay a burning wasteland, twisted steel beams clawing at the sky like the fingers of a giant skeleton. Dragging his shattered body, Yamaguchi staggered toward an air raid shelter. On the way, he witnessed scenes beyond comprehension. People with skin peeling off in strips like torn clothing, others whose eyes had burst from their sockets, children burned so badly it was impossible to tell if they were boys or girls. Some victims lost their skin entirely, slipping off like gloves when rescuers tried to touch them. I saw the silhouettes of people burned into stone walls, Yamaguchi recalled decades later. The only proof they had ever existed. Scientists came to call this phenomenon thermal radiation shadowing. When the atomic flash bleached surfaces, the bodies of those who stood between the light and the wall absorbed part of the energy, leaving behind dark outlines. These weren't remains of flesh, but shadows, horrifying imprints of a final instant, when people burned away so quickly they left nothing but their shape behind. Eventually, Yamaguchi stumbled into a half-destroyed concrete building where other survivors huddled together. That night he drifted on the edge of consciousness, slipping again and again into merciful darkness, while radiation sickness had already begun its silent assault on his body. Around him, voices cracked with desperation as people begged for a sip of water. But we couldn't drink from the river, he recalled. It was full of corpses. At dawn, he made a decision that would change his life forever. Despite his severe injuries, Yamaguchi resolved to return to Nagasaki to reach his wife and infant son. The thought of my family kept me on my feet, he said. I kept seeing my boy's face, and that vision forced my legs to move. His burned body, wrapped in makeshift bandages and still oozing fluids, carried him onto the brutal journey toward the train station. Many bridges had been destroyed by the blast, forcing long, exhausting detours. The station itself was damaged but still operating. A miracle in the midst of chaos, and his only chance to escape the inferno. Passengers stared at him with a mix of horror and sympathy. His scarred and blistered body frightened them, yet his sheer determination commanded respect. As the train pulled away from Hiroshima's ruins, Yamaguchi had no idea he was not heading toward safety, but straight into the same nightmare all over again. The ride to Nagasaki felt like a fever dream, a blur of pain and stubborn willpower. For 30 hours he drifted in and out of consciousness. Burns covered nearly a third of his body, and keloid scars had already begun to form. Marks that would forever define him as Hibakusha, a survivor of the bomb. The pain was indescribable, he later said, but strangely enough it kept me alive. As long as I could feel it, I knew I was still breathing. On the evening of August 8th, the train finally arrived in Nagasaki. Yamaguchi could barely stand, his body on the verge of collapse, with yet another ordeal waiting ahead. He still had several kilometers to walk home. Every step was agony. I counted them, he remembered. 10 more steps, then another 10, and then I could rest. When the door opened, his wife, Hisako, faced a burned and disfigured stranger. His skin hung in shreds, his eyes bloodshot from ruptured capillaries. But Hisako did not scream or faint. She simply said, "You're home. I'll take care of you," Yamaguchi recalled with a tender smile. In that moment, I knew I would survive. That night, Hisako tended to him with the only remedies she had, smearing his burns with a mixture of potato starch and cooking oil. In his delirium, he told her about the hell he had seen in Hiroshima, an entire city erased by a single bomb. She didn't believe him. She thought I was delirious with fever, Yamaguchi later recalled. To her, it sounded like madness. At that time, Japan lived under strict information control. Censorship banned any mention of military defeats or civilian casualties. Radio broadcasts carried on as if nothing had happened. Only a small circle of military leaders suspected that America had used a new and terrifying weapon. But those reports were kept secret. That's why Yamaguchi's words sounded unbelievable to his wife and colleagues. And that's also why the people of Nagasaki took no special precautions, even though they themselves were the next target. Despite Hisako's pleas for him to stay home, the next morning, August 9th, Tsutomu insisted on returning to work. "We need the money. And I have to warn my colleagues about this new weapon," he said. He limped toward the Mitsubishi office, his bandaged body drawing stares on the steps. Instead of sympathy, he met only doubt. His co-workers simply didn't believe his story about Hiroshima. "My boss looked at me like I had lost my mind," Yamaguchi recalled. He said, "You're an engineer. You know one bomb can't wipe out an entire city." As Yamaguchi struggled to describe the blinding flash and massive destruction, a familiar, yet impossible, brightness suddenly filled the room. "I thought, this can't be happening again," he said. His first thought was that the bomb had somehow followed him from Hiroshima. At exactly 11:02 a.m., the second bomb exploded over Nagasaki. The plutonium weapon, nicknamed Fat Man, detonated at about 1,650 feet above the city. Even more powerful than Little Boy, it unleashed the energy of 21,000 tons of TNT. And once again, Yamaguchi found himself only about 3 kilometers from ground zero. The thick concrete walls of Mitsubishi softened the blast slightly, but the sheer chance of it all, the near impossibility of surviving 2 atomic bombings, shattered the limits of imagination. Historian Richard B. Frank calculated the odds of such survival at 1 in 100 trillion, as if losing the world's worst lottery twice. The shock wave ripped through the building, shattering windows and tearing away parts of the roof. Through the ringing in his ears, Yamaguchi heard his stunned boss whisper, "You were right." It was a grim vindication no one would ever want. The second flash left ghostly burn marks on Yamaguchi's retinas as the world around him dissolved into chaos. One thought cut through the terror with brutal clarity. His family was in the direction of the blast. "In Hiroshima, I had no one to protect," he explained later. "Here in Nagasaki, my heart turned to ice. I had survived, but I feared I might lose everything that mattered." He forced his twice irradiated body to move, ignoring colleagues who begged him to remain in the relative safety of the damaged building. The road home became a nightmare. Familiar streets transformed into twisted steel and smoldering ruins. Scorched air filled with radioactive dust shredded his lungs like glass with every breath. "I was a walking corpse," Yamaguchi said. "My bandages had torn. My half-healed burns were seared all over again, but I kept moving because there was no other choice." The body's reaction to radiation followed a grimly predictable pattern. First came nausea, vomiting, headaches, and fever, often within hours. Then a deceptive lull, the latent phase when patients might appear to recover. But soon after, the illness returned with brutal force. Hair fell out in clumps, bleeding and infections set in, and sometimes entire organs shut down. For Tsutomu, the danger was even greater. He was exposed to radiation a second time, while still in that latent phase from Hiroshima. It was a medical scenario without precedent. By every calculation, the combined dose should have killed him many times over. And yet, he lived. The area where his home once stood had become a wasteland of rubble and ash. Yamaguchi's heart pounded as he began to recognize familiar landmarks. A stone lantern, a distinctive tree. This was where his house had been. What he found shook him to his core. The home nearly destroyed. The roof collapsed inward, only fragments of the walls still standing. No signs of movement, no signs of life. Silence pressed in, broken only by the distant cries of the wounded and the crackle of scattered fires. "Hisako, Katsutoshi," he called, his voice cracked and broken. Hours dragged on like years as Yamaguchi searched among the ruins, digging through debris, staring into the faces of the dead, and praying not to recognize them. "I looked at every corpse," he recalled later. "I begged fate not to let it be them. But at the same time, I needed to know the truth." As night fell and radiation sickness began to take hold, waves of nausea, fever climbing to dangerous levels, he still kept searching. Near midnight, barely able to stand, he made his way to a prearranged shelter where locals gathered during air raids. And there, in the crowd of exhausted survivors, he saw Hisako and little Katsu. "In that moment," he said, "life returned to my body." When their eyes met across the darkness of the packed shelter, Yamaguchi broke down in tears. "I knew then that there was still goodness in this world worth living for." But the reunion carried a bitter edge. Hisako had received a dangerous dose of radiation while searching for food near Ground Zero, and both she and their infant son soon suffered the effects. Still, in that moment, they simply held one another. 3 living bodies sharing warmth in a world gone cold. We clung to each other and wept, Yamaguchi remembered. What else was there to do? In the days that followed, their suffering only deepened. Radiation sickness showed no mercy. Hair falling out in handfuls, relentless vomiting leaving them dehydrated, bleeding from gums and mucous membranes draining their strength. They desperately needed medical help that the shattered city could not provide. And then, on August 15th, just 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, the voice of Emperor Hirohito reached ordinary Japanese citizens for the first time. His announcement of surrender ended the war. Yet, for the Yamaguchi family, huddled in their shelter while radiation slowly unraveled their DNA, it brought no relief. They had survived 2 atomic attacks, but ahead of them lay a different kind of battle, one that would last the rest of their lives. The rain after the bombings was black, he recalled. Radioactive dust settled onto their skin, leaving strange patterns that would not wash away, visible traces of an invisible poison. The following years became a kind of living experiment that medical science had never encountered. His family suffered from acute radiation syndrome. Their cells were destroyed and regenerated in chaotic rhythms unknown to medicine. Every morning I checked my pillow, Yamaguchi said, to see how much hair had fallen out overnight. In the mirror, I no longer saw myself. The face staring back was disfigured, unrecognizable. We became a medical mystery with no cure. Daily life for his family was reduced to the most primitive struggle: survival at any cost. They had to search for food that wasn't tainted by radiation, secure clean water, and find even the most basic medical care in a country left in ruins after defeat. But beyond the physical hardship came another wound: social rejection, which cut as deeply as the burns. People avoided us, Yamaguchi remembered. Some believed radiation was contagious. Others turned away when they saw my keloid scars. Children called us monsters. Discrimination touched every aspect of life: jobs, housing, even the chance to marry. Many hibakusha hid their status for decades, terrified that if the truth came out, they would be shunned. On top of the physical injuries and social isolation came a heavier burden: psychological trauma. Survivors lived under constant fear, what psychologists now call radiation anxiety syndrome. It was the endless expectation of sickness, the dread that hidden damage would one day appear as cancer, or that their children would be born with deformities. That fear made people hypervigilant. Every ache or unexplained symptom sparked panic and existential dread. Added to that was survivor's guilt. Why did I live when so many others died? Many hibakusha internalized society's stigma, coming to see themselves as tainted or unclean. And it wasn't until the 1980s, nearly 40 years after the bombings, that the Japanese government finally began offering psychological support. In 1957, thanks to years of relentless pressure from survivor groups, the government established an official system to recognize hibakusha, granting minimal medical benefits and some financial aid. Yamaguchi applied and was certified as a Nagasaki survivor. Yet, no matter how many times he insisted that he had also endured Hiroshima, officials stubbornly refused to acknowledge his double experience. The bureaucracy didn't know what to do with someone like me, he said with a gentle smile. On the forms, there was a box for Hiroshima or for Nagasaki. Not both. It was easier for them to pretend I didn't exist than to create a new category. Despite everything, Yamaguchi showed incredible resilience. He returned to work at Mitsubishi, resumed his engineering career, and eventually devoted his skills to designing ships meant for peace, not for war. Together with his wife, Hisako, they raised their son, Katsutoshi, and later welcomed two daughters, Naoko and Toshiko. Their family life carried both moments of joy and the weight of long shadows. Over time, Hisako developed kidney and liver problems caused by radiation exposure. The most painful tragedy was their son's fate. As an infant, he had absorbed radiation through his mother's breast milk, leaving him sickly for most of his life. In 2005, he died of cancer at just 59. The bombs, Yamaguchi said in his later years, killed the dead quickly, but the living they kill slowly. For decades after the war, his extraordinary story remained largely unknown. Like many other hibakusha, he chose silence for years, unwilling to relive the trauma or invite further discrimination. He focused instead on his career and family. But in his old age, as he watched nuclear programs spread across the world, he realized time was running out. Soon, there will be no one left who saw these weapons with their own eyes. If I remain silent, who will speak for the hundreds of thousands who are gone? The quiet engineer gradually transformed into one of the most remarkable and unique voices against nuclear weapons. Starting in the 1980s, he began speaking publicly, first in local classrooms, then to wider audiences, and eventually on international stages. His journey from silence to testimony mirrored the broader arc of the hibakusha community. Years of silence, 1945 to 1954, under occupation censorship and fear of stigma. A period of local remembrance, 1955 to 1970. Political activism, 1971 to 1990, when survivor groups began to influence government policy. And, finally, global testimony after 1991, as the aging of witnesses made their stories urgently necessary. Historians note similar waves of memory among other communities that endured mass trauma, from Holocaust survivors to victims of modern war crimes. In 2006, at the age of 90, Yamaguchi published his memoir, Twice Bombed, Twice Survived. The book captured global attention at a time when debates about nuclear proliferation were once again intensifying. I don't consider myself special or lucky, he often told journalists who focused on the statistical miracle of his survival. I simply have a duty to speak for those who no longer can. It was not until March 2009 that the Japanese government finally recognized him as the only officially documented person to have survived both atomic bombings. The decision came just months before his death, after decades of bureaucratic resistance. The most powerful moment of his activism came with his speech at the United Nations. Addressing world leaders, he spoke with the moral authority of lived experience. Nuclear weapons are not weapons of war. They are instruments of annihilation, bringing suffering across generations. He warned that the creation of the atomic bomb marked a threshold humanity must never cross again. In a conversation with filmmaker James Cameron, who was preparing a documentary about the hibakusha, Yamaguchi offered the words that became his most quoted line. "The only reason I fear death is because then I will no longer be able to tell my story." On January 4, 2010, at the age of 93, Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away in Nagasaki from stomach cancer, a disease likely tied directly to his double radiation exposure. He died less than a year after the Japanese government finally recognized his unique place in history. The man who had survived 2 atomic attacks left one final message for future generations. I want young people to know that nuclear weapons were used twice, and their destructive power does not end when the mushroom cloud fades away. Yamaguchi's life mirrored humanity's complicated relationship with technology, from creativity and progress to destruction, and ultimately to wisdom born of suffering. Born in the age of steam, he lived into the digital era. Yet 9 days in August 1945 compressed his entire existence into moments that defined not only his destiny, but also our collective understanding of war. His story defies statistics, with survival odds once estimated at 1 in 100 trillion, and at the same time reveals the transformation of a victim into both a witness and a guardian. I believe God allowed me to live so that I could tell what truly happened, Yamaguchi said. Not for pity, but so people could understand what this weapon does to human beings. Today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are rebuilt and thriving cities. Most of the visible scars have healed, but the shadow of radiation still lingers in the generations that followed. Living memory survives in testimonies like Yamaguchi's, which turn abstract figures, kilotons, and fallout into human stories that touch the soul. An engineer who twice endured atomic fire yet chose to design ships that connected people rather than destroy them left us with a question that remains as urgent now as it was in 1945. Having seen what humanity can do at its most destructive, and having survived it, what will we choose to create with the time we've been given? If this extraordinary story of survival against impossible odds moved you, know that there are many more tales of human resilience still to be told. Share in the comments which part of Yamaguchi's journey struck you most: his physical fight for survival, his unshakable spirit, or his transformation from victim into the voice of millions. And always remember, even in the darkest chapters of history, the brightest expressions of our humanity can emerge.